we're back in record time.
My name's Sam Alexander, and I hope you'll forgive my attire, my Grover gloves, my mask during this plague, let's call it, of biblical proportions. I was born in 1943 in Bath, Maine, in what we as teenagers called Drax Castle, the old Bath Memorial Hospital. Even at that point in time was a bit run down and I think looked down upon by the newer hospitals. But my dad worked at Torrey Roller Bush and Company in Bath, which that company provided port lights and other pieces of ships being built at the ironworks, both at the ironworks and in South Portland. So my mother went down to the Bath Hospital for my birth. And I came home a week later in the middle of a huge ice storm. My mother told me about it. Of course, I don't remember it, but they came home in my uncle's Buick and drove up to the farm, and it was so icy in the yard, according to my mother, that my father and Uncle John Wilson laid down planks and boards across the yard so she could get in the house with me. I was their second son. My brother David was 13 months older, and we are the only children of Samuel P. and Myrtle E. Alexander. My name is Samuel W. I had no middle name up until the time my parents decided I should have a Social Security number. So they gave me a list of family names, and I chose William. I was unimpressed with my father's middle name, which was Pennell. Growing up on the farm, in hindsight, was a wonderful time. Of course, at the time, I didn't think so. My brother and I were basically free as birds most of the time. Of course, there were rules, things you didn't do and things you had to do. We had chores, everyday chores, and at a fairly young age, we had some chores such as milk the cow in the evening, feed the cows. My dad kept cattle. He traded cattle a bit. After the war was over, I would have been 3 years old. Torrey's in Bath closed, and he was unemployed for a year or so. So to keep food on the table, we got in the habit of growing a great big garden. That was another of my brother and I chores, was hoeing the garden, weeding the garden. We were given a bounty of 1 cent per cutworm we picked off the tomato plants. Things like that. We, of course, when we were 5 and 6, went to West Harpswell Grammar School. Had to walk out the half-mile road in the morning and back in the afternoon when we got home. My recollections of riding on the bus are pretty slim in the early years, but I do recall in 1949, I believe 50, the Korean War going on, and the bus driver would have the radio on every afternoon listening to the news reports about the war, and I was pretty horrified as a child at the number of people who were dying and the conditions of it. And I worried that war would arrive in Harpswell at any time. So that was one of my childhood worries. One of the first incidents that I still remember as a child was during hunting season. Hunting season was sort of a wild affair in those days because gangs of men would get together and they would drive deer the length of the neck. and then they would turn around and drive them back up the neck, and they would station shooters at certain strategic locations during this deer drive, and one of those locations was the road into the farm and the edge of the field at the farm. So one November day, one morning, we were out in the yard, my brother and I, and we heard these sounds up in the trees of zip, 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 zip. And so we ran in the house and said to my mother, "Mama, there's angry bees in the maple trees in the front yard." And she said, "What? Angry bees zipping through the maple trees?" She stepped out on the porch and she heard that, and she hollered, "Get in the house instantly." It was a couple of shooters out in the road. Some deer had crossed the road and they opened fire and obviously emptied their guns and then reloaded and shot again. So there were hazards in those days, different ones than there are today, of course, but we had an idyllic growing up. That's not to say that we didn't work. My dad paid the taxes on the farm, and our school clothes were bought from money we made every winter. He cut 10 or 12 cords of pulpwood and sold it to Bajepscut Paper Company. And so Saturday and often Sunday mornings, we were marshaled out of bed at 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and had our breakfast and trooped out to the woods, and we became woodsmen in short order. My dad cut the trees down with a one-man buck saw, and it was my brother and I's job to limb the trees up with an axe and then to junk it up into 4-foot lengths with a two-man crosscut. And for young guys of 9 or 10 years old, we were pretty good woodsmen. And in fact, that's how we made our first money. We would get the 10 or 12 cords of pulpwood that my dad sold to pay expenses, taxes, and clothes and all of that. And then my brother and I would go off on our own and cut another 2 or 3 cords of pulpwood, and my father would arrange to have it hauled to the mill in Pajepscut at the same time his wood was hauled. So in that manner, we made what we thought at the time was a small fortune. Actually, in hindsight, it was very little money, but we were inspired. We became entrepreneurs. Another thing we did to make money was traveling around the neighborhood. There were 10 or 12 people who hired us to mow the lawn. And in the beginning, we mowed the lawns with a push lawnmower, an old hand push lawnmower, which we sort of rebuilt and sharpened the blades on so it would do a little better mowing lawns. But then we saw that we could go to Sears Roebuck and buy a motorized lawnmower, push motorized lawnmower. And so I recall buying a Sears Roebuck push lawnmower for $22 at Sears Roebuck and Company in Bath, and we expanded our lawn mowing operations. My father didn't ride us around much. Most of our lawns were in walking distance. So with the lack of traffic in those days, we pushed the lawnmower down 123, mowed the lawn, and pushed the lawnmower back to the farm. We tried to bunch up our lawns so that we could do them on the same day, usually a Saturday, sometimes a Sunday. And so my brother and I, to my mother's dismay, used that as an excuse to avoid going to church very often. Of course, in the wintertime, that didn't pass, and we did go to Kellogg Church, Elijah Kellogg Church, probably a couple times a month through the winter when we weren't out in the woods cutting pulpwood. So when we got a bit older, young teenagers, we roamed the neighborhood of North Harpswell extensively. We would go down to the shore in the summer, go swimming, dig clams, build ourselves a little boat and go as far offshore as we dared to in that boat. Another one of our chores was bailing out a Hampton boat that my Uncle Thurlow kept at our shore. He was dean of the School of Engineering at Northeastern in those days, and he had 3 weeks vacation every summer. The first 2 weeks, most of the time was spent fixing up the Hampton boat. He worked like, he got down to the cottage and he worked like a dog. He's painting, caulking, fixing anything mechanical. And then we would go down to the shore, my father, brother, and I, with the oxen, and haul the boat off, launch it off a cradle into the water, and he would put it on his mooring. And my brother and I's extra chore in the summer was to go down daily and pump out the Hampton boat because it leaked badly. A day, for instance, after we had had a rainstorm, the next day we'd get aboard the Hampton boat. The water would be above the floorboards of the Hampton boat. And so we sometimes had a little water to pump out. Sometimes we had a lot of water to pump out of that old boat. But mostly we worked around the farm, or we were off with our chums playing baseball, riding bicycles, and, quote, exploring. And we did a lot of exploring. We rode for miles most every day. But there were rules. You had to be home at mealtime. If you weren't there at mealtime, you didn't go anywhere the next day. So we observed the rules. Warren Norton was our grammar school principal at West Harpswell. In the beginning, it was Grace Knight. Both were rather formidable individuals in their role as principal and teacher. Goldie Morse was our first 3-grade school teacher, and she ruled with an iron hand. But in hindsight, all these people provided us with a great education. I mean, a really good education. There was fun and sports involved too, but mainly you had your nose to the grindstone. Not much homework, thankfully, because when my brother and I got home after school, we were to feed the cows, milk the cow. We generally had only 1 or 2 cows who were fresh and were giving milk. And if you've ever milked a cow, you know that can be a tremendously frustrating experience. Pull up the milk stool, clean the cow's udder with a freshly sterilized milk pail. Well, the first thing the cow does is swat you beside the head with her stinky tail. The second thing she does repeatedly is try to step in the milk bucket. You learn pretty quickly not to set the milk bucket down on the barn floor. You hold it between your knees and then you milk. Well, that leaves you prone to a kick. You have to be pretty quick to both grab the milk pail and jump up quick enough to avoid a cow's kick when you're milking her. In fact, you have to be damned agile. That's how I would put it. So that was one of our chores. The other big job on the farm was haying season. And that's how my brother and I became pretty good mechanics. My dad was a so-so mechanic. And one year he pulled the mowing machine out of the barn, and as he left for work, he said, over the next week or so, God bless it, I've got to do some work on that mower. So while he was going to work that day, my brother and I disassembled the mowing machine, took the knife out, took it in the shop, filed it with a file, put it back in, and tuned it up. adjusted the fingers and all of that so that it would cut good. And we also greased and oiled the mower and fixed anything we thought needed fixing, tightened up loose bolts. And the first time we mowed with it behind the old homemade Model A Ford tractor, my father stopped halfway through up the field, and we were standing there to see how well it would mow. He said, "I believe you boys have worked yourself into a new job." So in those days, we had no baler, we had no factory-made tractor. The big purchase in 1952 was a new McCormick Deering side delivery rake, which we raked the hay with. Prior to that, we had an old horse-drawn dump rake that we towed behind the old tractor. And we put the hay up in the barn loose, hauled it in with the tractor, and had a big set of wagon wheels that previously had been used for a dump cart that a yoke of oxen would pull. We rebuilt that so we could tow it behind the tractor. And behind that, my father purchased a used hay loader. And so with our train, tractor, hay rack, hay loader, we would go around the field and load hay that way. And on days when my dad worked the evening shift at Pajevsky Paper Company in those days, and the hay would be dry in the field, my brother and I did the haying. We would take turns. One of us would drive the old homemade tractor, and the other would stand in the hay rack and pitch the hay forward and make the load. And we became fairly adept at it. And there was a fellow who worked at the paper mill with my father that thought that haying and farm work was probably quite a fun job and something he'd like to try. So one afternoon when my dad was at work, they worked opposite shifts. I remember his nickname was Spider. And my brother and I apparently had developed a mean streak in the meantime and decided we were going to kind of put it to him. So we said, my brother said, "I'll drive the tractor," and I said, "I'll stand in front of the hay rack. All you have to do is pitch the hay forward from the hay loader." So we trucked along at a pretty brisk pace, and we buried him in hay. And then after you had a load of hay, of course, you hauled it down to the barn and unloaded it, and you pitched it off by hand. So we stationed him up in the hay mow, and the two of us pitched the hay out of the hay rack up into the mow, and we buried him again. At the end of the afternoon, I think he never wanted to see another spear of hay in his entire life, and he told my father that he thought that we had plotted to abuse him. So that was haying on the farm. Then going to Brunswick High School was a whole new experience, and I was kind of introverted, and the first couple years of Brunswick High School were a struggle because different teachers getting used to being with other people, other students especially, and not knowing what the deal was and not being able to find your locker nor even open it when you found it with a combination lock, which we were unfamiliar with. But we caught on. I think a pivotal person in my life was Mrs. Nathan Dane, who was English teacher at Brunswick High School. Her husband Nate was a professor at Bowdoin College. And up to that point, I didn't have a whole lot of interest in school. I could do it fairly easily, but I wasn't inspired. And to me, getting a C was as good as getting an A. But she turned things around. It became clear that I liked her, and I suspected she liked me fairly well. And I remember one day in particular in junior, first semester English class, we were doing grammar, and I was extremely bored with grammar. I could do it easily, and I was impatient with the other people who weren't getting it, that she had to spend extra time with. And she apparently could see that I wasn't paying attention. She said, "Mr. Alexander, are you listening?" "Oh, yes." And she asked me a question, which I answered immediately, not from listening, but from knowing English grammar pretty well. She turned around and thought for a minute. She says, "You're bored, aren't you, Mr. Alexander?" I said, "Yes, I am." And I think she was surprised by my being frank with her. And she said, "Why are you bored?" I said, "Because English grammar is pretty old hat to me, and I'm anxious for you to get on to literature." And she said, "Don't you worry, I'll give you some literature." And she assigned 3 books to read in the next 2 weeks, so, to me only. So I read the books, and I loved it. I loved the books, and from then on, we were the best of friends. She taught us Shakespeare, specifically Hamlet, Macbeth. She had a sort of a program where she would assign good works of literature to people who were interested, give them the opportunity, rather. She didn't really assign it. The whole class had their basic assignments, but other people were given the opportunity to do more, of course, and I did. And so I became known as Mrs. Dane's pet. I had her for both semesters when I was a junior at Brunswick High and both semesters when I was a senior. I think in those days that the teachers had some latitude to pick their students. She was known as the English teacher who made you work. And most of my contemporaries didn't want to work in English. So I belatedly thank her for what she did for me. And that was a real turning point. I became interested in schoolwork and did pretty well at it. So well, actually, that my senior year, Jack Caldwell, who was the vice principal and guidance counselor, called me up to the office one day, and first question out of his mouth was, "What are you doing taking shop classes? You should be in college course. You should be planning to go to the University of Maine or MIT or somewhere like that for a degree in engineering." And I said, "I appreciate that, but I don't want to spend my life inside." He says, "Well, many engineers spend their lives outside." I said, "Not the important ones." And so he didn't know what to say, and I didn't know what to say further. I felt that I was going to get reprimanded for being a little bit sassy with him, and maybe sent him to Mario Tonan's office. He was the principal. And you didn't mess with Mario Tonan. He was known to be even physically abusive, let's say. So Jack Caldwell says, "I see. Well, I certainly hope you change your mind," and sent me back to class. Which I thought about that for a while, and I thought perhaps I should, but I couldn't stand the thought of sitting in an office because I was an outdoor kid and I wanted to stay that way. Hindsight says it would have been smarter to go to a 4-year college and then do as I pleased after I had seen the bigger world. And my Uncle Thurlow always said about my father, when someone would ask if he had any brothers, he would say, "Yeah, the smart one stayed on the farm." And my dad had, in those days, graduated from Brunswick High School, and they taught what would be known as a classical education. For instance, he could quote Milton. And lots of the other classics from memory, and I was really impressed with that. He never went on to further education. I went to what's now known as Southern Maine Community College, and took the building construction course, and spent most of my life building houses as an independent contractor. There's all sorts of stories I could tell you about that, but they would run to this, become very similar.
So Sam, before you go in that direction, could you tell us a little more about your childhood and as a teenager and your interaction with other parts of the town and the summer people?
I didn't have a whole lot to do with other parts of the town, other than the people we mowed lawns for. One thing we did mowing lawns was go all the way down to Barnes Island on Basin Point and mow the lawns for the Appels. Now, the Appel family was, of course, Helen Norton was an Appel, and she and her brother, I think his name was Richard, owned Barnes Island and still do. And they were summer residents. I believe that's how Walter Norton met Helen, was at a summer dance at the Grange Hall. We would ride in the morning down the road with the man who carried the mail down to the South Harpswell post office. He would drop us off at the school, West Harpswell, and we'd push the lawnmower down the Basin Point Road, down the Barnes Island Road, down there. And we had to time it so that the tide was low enough to walk across the bar with the lawnmower and down the island, mow the lawn, and do a little trimming. They had a few other jobs they had us do a little painting on the cottage, scraping and painting, or trimming bushes, clipping, things like that, and get back in time enough to make the tide, to get back across there before the tide was up so much that you couldn't wade across. You couldn't push the lawnmower across, obviously, anyway, if the tide was up any at all. So that was sort of an adventure. You had to time it to get across there on the falling tide and get back before the coming tide. And other people, we met other summer children, basically, at baseball games and the like, and a few of them, I recall, played on the town baseball team with us. That was an adventure too. Arnold LeMay was the coach, and I recall Ronnie LeClaire was an older guy who played on the town team, and Arnie and his brother and several older men, a group of us grammar school and high school kids, and we did play baseball weekly through the summer. Sunday afternoons were devoted to baseball at Williams Field, which is now part of the Land Trust properties. We would also get aboard Ronnie LeClaire's lobster boat, go to Chebeague Island, play the Chebeague Islanders. We would go as far inland as Lisbon Falls, Monmouth, Sabattus, and play those town teams. Our goal was to beat the Lisbon Falls team. They always had a good baseball team. In fact, a lot of the guys who played with them went on to minor league baseball. We had a good team and we had fun. And so we went to social affairs, Grange every Friday night.
What was that like?
That was fun, and that was, I think nowadays, that was part of my education too. There were weekly dances after the Grange meeting. The Grange had a 5-piece orchestra, people who played. I mentioned Grace Knight previously. She played the piano at the dances. My dad played the drums. They had a fellow from Thompson who played the saxophone. Somebody would show up with a fiddle. and I danced with all the older ladies. There weren't a lot of young people who went, only the children of Grange members. I'm sure David Chipman knows about that too. My ancestors were Scots-Irish who came from Ireland. They were Scotsmen, but they came from Ireland, Ulster, a little town in Ulster particularly. They came in 1719 with what became sort of a flood of Scots-Irish who were fleeing persecution. I have a little pamphlet, the script actually, from the reenactment of the first Harpswell town meeting, which gives a little bio of the inhabitants, and it says the Alexanders, the Ewings, and other families came from Ulster fleeing persecution because they were religious persecution, because they were Presbyterians, number one. And the king, of course, James, was trying to force them to swear allegiance to the Church of England. In addition to that, there was famine in the land, in Ireland especially at that time. And so they came by ship. They, to my knowledge, came to Falmouth, which is now Portland, of course, in 1718, 1719. My ancestors apparently came in 1719 and stopped in Falmouth. It was late in the year. They decided to go to Merrymeeting Bay and anchor for the winter, and there they could go hunting ashore and that sort of thing. They spent the winter in Merrymeeting Bay. My original ancestor in Maine was a man named David Alexander. He was here with his two sons. William was the eldest, James the youngest. William would have been a teenager, 16, 17. They built a cabin on the Cat-Ants River in Topsham, and of course it probably took them a year or two to get established there, but David was killed by the Native Americans in 1722, 1723. No one knows the date for sure. But subsequently, William came to Harpswell, and James went inland to Bowden. And William, whom is my direct ancestor, built a cabin at the head of Widgeon Cove, which is between Neil's Point and the mainland at Harpswell Center here, not very far from here, perhaps a half a mile. And I don't know how long he was there, but he married a woman named Janet Wilson, who apparently had come here with the Wilsons on the same ship, actually, from Ulster. And they started farming, and of course there was subsistence, whatever you could shoot, whatever you could fish, whatever you could grow. And there was, this, in those days, of course, the threat of Indian raids down here even. But Harpswell was much more settled in those days. During that time period, 1722, 23, there was a series of Indian wars. That one was known as Lovewell's War. But that's neither here nor there. But in those days, Topsham and Brunswick were basically deserted, except for a few families living in the blockhouse. Harpswell had far more inhabitants in those days than either Brunswick or Topsham. And the Alexanders apparently prospered here. The first Harpswell town meeting was held in William Alexander's house on Neil's Point at what is now known as Two Coves Farm. And I mentioned the reenactment of that first town meeting that was held in 1958 at Cundy's Harbor Hall. I had the script of that. My dad played William Alexander, and I recall that Bill Pierce played Wade Weber. David Hackett played, I think, Elisha Allen. There were other families who are still here in town who played the characters from that original town meeting. And over the years, I have a copy of David Alexander's. He would have been third generation Alexanders in Maine here, of his will. And he had done very well indeed. He died in at the age of 50-something. He left to his children entire farms, his male children. He left to his daughters shares in sailing ships and sheep and household furnishings. And from his will, you can interpret that his children each had a farm of their own. Each seemed to be doing very well, that he held shares in half a dozen sailing ships. And thus became the other Alexander and Harpswell profession of shipbuilding. My ancestors apparently worked at the Pennell shipyard in Pennellville, just across the bay from the Alexander Farm as it exists today, during the fall, winter, and spring. And in the winters, they walked across the ice to work at the shipyard. I have my great-great-grandfather Isaac's daybook, and it's a tremendous record. The whole family worked there, including the women. The women painted the interiors of the captain's quarters, for instance. All the men worked there, working on the ships, hauling timber, cutting timber, hewing timber. And not only did they do that, but they kept the farm as well. So you can imagine what kind of a day it was. You got up before daylight, you tended the animals, had your breakfast, got dressed, walked about 2 miles across the frozen bay to work until dark on a ship. And that was not easy work. If you know anything about shipbuilding, you know that it's really hard manual labor. There are no, quote, good jobs. But Charles Alexander, my ancestor, who died at the age of 30 in Cuba of yellow fever, he made the bad decision to ship out and on his second trip died in Cuba of yellow fever. But he was paid $1 a day, which was tremendous pay in those days. Everybody else who worked at the Pennell Yard was paid on the order of $1 a week. He was the master shipwright, if you want to call it that, master carpenter. He fitted out the captain's quarters. He did all the fine woodworking on the ships. Let me go back a little bit, and some of them became sailors, shipmasters, ship's agents, things like that. For instance, Pennell Alexander was ship's agent, and he was the agent for some Schofield ships, some Pennell ships, and of course he was agent for the Alexanders, who owned shares in a lot of those ships. When you worked like that, you weren't paid wages generally. You took your wages as shares in the ship. And if the ship sunk on the maiden voyage, that was it. No pay, all that work was wasted. If the ship made money, though, you could become, in fact, wealthy if you owned a lot of shares in ships. And I don't know, I guess it was a little of both. You accepted enough money for your work to get by, but you took the rest in shares in the ships. And that's the way it worked at most of the shipyards. Later on, a few Alexanders became ship captains, as I said, but mostly the Alexanders remained shipbuilders and farmers. In the mid-19th century, the 1850s, 1860s, a contingent of them moved to the town of Richmond and went to work for a ship owner named T.J. Southard, who was quite famous. He owned at least 6 or 8 large sailing vessels, 3 masters and bigger, and became quite wealthy, rode around in a buggy. He was a very small man. There are lots of anecdotes about TJ. One of my Alexander ancestors, in fact, married his daughter, Jane Southard. And so we became entwined with the Southards. We already were intermarried and entwined with the Pennells and the Dunnings, which was another old Harpswell family. So I have a huge connection to the town of Harpswell. In fact, my ancestors probably would rise out of their grave and kill me if I didn't stay around Harpswell and weren't interested in the things that they spent their lives doing. Let's go back to the Grange. I received what I would consider a lot of my education going to Grange. How to dance, and I loved going dancing ever since. My wife Janet and I have taken ballroom dance classes a lot. We haven't in recent years, but we used to go to Portland weekly, take dance classes, stay for the dance. At one point I was taking 3 different dance classes a week, riding back and forth to Portland all the time. So I consider that part of my education too. My dad asked me why we felt we had to ride to Portland to take dance classes. Weren't there qualified dance instructors in Brunswick or this area? And I said, my reply was, because I don't want to be anybody's fool when it comes to dancing. And he laughed and he said, thought for a minute or two, yeah, I guess that's a good enough reason. So that was an offshoot, a later offshoot when I was able, both physically and had the time to take classes like that from my days at the Grange as a youngster. Dancing, the contra dances, the country dances, and they played waltzes and foxtrots, and Latin was unheard of around here at that time. But
I know you're still involved with the Grange, but has your family always been involved with it?
Yes, they have. The framing lumber for the Grange, in fact, came from the Alexander Woodlot over on Great Island, and was floated over to West Bath to what was called Berry's Mill, sawed into lumber, and hauled back by barge, and the Grange Hall was built from that lumber. In fact, the Alexander part of the Grange starts well before that. My great-grandfather William was one of the founders of Harpswell Academy, which they built a building there where the Grange now stands. It was Italian, I think it was Italian in style, and they hired a schoolmaster and they taught, quote, scholars. It was a prep school for students who were high school students or had graduated from high school and were preparing to go to college. But it became fewer and fewer, quote, scholars, and they couldn't pay the expenses and finally were forced to close after only 10 or 15 years of operating. That building was used by the town, and it was used by town groups for different things such as plays and minstrel shows and dances, things of that nature, until it burned in 1903. And if you're not familiar with Earl Shuttleworth and Joyce Bibber's book, Images of America, Harpswell, take a look in that. There's a picture, two pictures on one page of the building burning, smoke coming out of the eaves, and then a picture below it of the building completely engulfed in flames. Of course, there was no fire department in those days, so it burned completely. But American E. Grange was built on that foundation, and my family had been intimately involved in both the Academy and the Grange.
What's the role of the Grange now? It used to be agriculture. What is it nowadays?
I think you could say it's more of a community social organization. We're hanging on, pardon me, as a Grange, but we're pretty low on members. We do hold regular meetings, and we're still going on. We've had a successful fundraising effort to raise money to conserve the building. It was through the efforts of John Aw and Lily Ott and myself. It has been designated as a national landmark by the National Park Service, and that status has enabled us to raise money to do a lot of needed repairs on the Grange, and we're in the process of doing that, replacing rotten sills, doing drainage and foundation work, which all costs a lot of money and all doesn't show. We intend to get the building painted. The roof needs to be coated. There are other areas that need to be rebuilt. We've replaced one interior floor that actually had a hole in it. And the building, of course, has to be preserved in its original state, so we're rebuilding the back house on the back of the building, which was the people at Maine Historic Preservation made a point of saying that we know that the back house is in bad condition, but don't tear it off, which tickled a lot of people. But to make the building historically accurate, we're rebuilding the back house to preserve it. And so I'm involved in that a lot. My dad, I've been master of the Grange, and I've held a lot of different offices in the Grange. I wasn't a regular Grange attendant. I did not attend regularly, put it that way. During my married years, middle age, but since I've retired, I've especially become involved with the Grange. I was a member, of course, when I was young. I joined when I was 13, I think. I've been master. My son Chuck has been master several occasions. My dad was master on a couple of occasions. My uncle Serlo, all his friends from his days as dean at Northeastern know him as Bill, and he was became a rear admiral in the Navy, and all his acquaintances with them call him Bill, refer to him as Bill. But my grandfather was a founding member. His cousin Louis Alexander was a founding member. I think the Alexanders and the Pierces have been the people who have been most involved with the Grange over its life. It has changed, as Rob asked, quite a bit. When I was young and attended Grange, there was a full house every Friday night. The Grange met every Friday evening, and there was a dance afterwards. There was often potluck suppers there. It was, in fact, the social center of Harpswell.
I would say it still is, because during my time in Harpswell, you've put on these pancake breakfasts in the summer, and they are they fully fill the building. And then it's also become a place for Harpswell Aging at Home.
Yes, that's been a great thing, the Harpswell Aging at Home group as holds lunches at the Grange. It was a polling place for years, up until recent years. Whereupon they moved down to the Kellogg Church Parish Hall, but up until then it was the voting place on Harpswell Neck. Very much involved with the community, and even more so in those days. Bailey Island, a group of people from Bailey and Orr's Island came every week to Grange and were members, attended the meetings. John Pulsifer from Cundy's Harbor was Grange master, I recall, at one point in my growing up years. They came regularly. They put on minstrel shows. They had public suppers. We still do have some public suppers, not to the degree that they were held then. So that's been a great community place.
Are there any interesting personalities you remember from your Grange days?
Yes. I remember Frank Purington. He was master of the Grange for at least one period. He sailed with Frank Hodgkins on a sailing ship, and I was probably 8, 9, 10 years old, and during the meetings before I became a member, that is, you were banished to the downstairs and you were to be quiet. But Frank wasn't going upstairs to the meetings at that time. He was quite an old man, and he would tell sea stories, and I was transfixed. He talked with a nasal twang. I'm sure my eyes were bugged out, my mouth hanging open, but he would tell a story about sailing to Hong Kong. And he would say something like, "We were 5 days out of Hong Kong with a deck load of kerosene. Frank Hodgkins, he was a hard master, and I'll tell you, he run a hungry ship." He said, "And I'll tell you also that it was some snotty on the water." He said, "We had those cans lashed down so God himself couldn't have moved them, but it still several of them went overboard," he says. He says, "They say old hands don't get sick at sea, but it's not true." Things like that. And of course, I, as a young pup, I was just, wow. And I thought, wow, that was some adventure. And it was a tremendous adventure. And that was the 20th century when he did that. And sailing ships and their cargo hauling days were long over at that point, really. It was nothing like it had been in the 19th century. So what's his name? Coffin. R.P.T. Coffin has written a book, of which I have an original copy, thankfully, and it's called Captain John, Captain Abby. And the women took a much larger role than anybody realizes in shipping and shipbuilding those days, because this is a story about Captain John Pennell, who was in command of a Pennell ship. They made a trip. Their daughter, the children were born on these trips. They were born at anchor when they were in the Chinchas, loading guano for a return load. There's another pamphlet that Betsy, it's called The Diary of Betsy Alexander, that describes a trip that Captain Thomas Alexander made. His first stop was St. John, New Brunswick, to load coal. They went to England. She talks about shopping in Calais, going ashore and shopping in Calais. She talks about the sailors offloading the load, the shipment, and she talks about her son, who was 8, 9 years old at that time, climbing up in the rigging with the sailors. She talks about all sorts of aspects, being at anchor in the Chinches and visiting with other Harpswell ships back and forth, being invited aboard Captain Schofield's ship for dinner and having entertainment aboard the different ships. And on the way home, Captain John became, excuse me, I'm transposing stories. Captain Thomas was fine, but Captain John of the Pennell clan fell violently ill, and Abby had to take command of the ship. She not only commanded the ship and the sailors, but she did all the navigation too. So she was an accomplished woman. In the early days of the settlers, even further back, I think hindsight, a lot of people think that illiteracy was rampant, but it certainly wasn't in my family or the other, most of the other founding families of Harpswell. They were all literate, and they all read everything they could get their hands on.
You're one of the lucky ones who spent your whole life here in Harpswell.
Well, I consider myself the luckiest guy in the state of Maine to be still living here with that great long history, and to have the benefit of all that experience.
Do you want to talk about any of the changes you've seen in Harpswell during your lifetime, and any significant events, town events, that stand out in your mind?
Yeah, early on I felt having all that history and all that connection to Harpswell was a responsibility on my part, and I credit Laddie Whidden, who just passed away, with starting that for me. He served for, I think, 27 years as selectman, and he appointed me to the Harpswell Zoning Board of Appeals, which was created. Harpswell shoreland zoning was forced upon all the towns in 1974, I believe, and Laddie appointed me to the Board of Appeals, and I enjoyed it. And most of the people on it were older than I. David Hackett, Sr. was a member, Armand Schofield, most all these people have passed away. Dick Weeks from Cundy's Harbor, Andy Longley was chairman at that time. He's passed away. But that became quite an education too. And then I was a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, I think, for about 15 years, and chairman for 5, 6, 7 years of that time. And then I became a member of the Planning Board. Laddie appointed me to both of these boards, and eventually chairman of the Planning Board. And it gave me interaction with people who had projects in town, wanted to build something. On Sundays, we rode around and viewed the site, and we read the ordinance and tried to decide how their proposal fit the ordinance, whether it did or it didn't, and what were the possibilities. And on a couple of occasions, I recused myself and stepped down as both as a member of the board and as chairman, and sat in the audience and advocated for the applicants, which was, I think, unheard of up to that point in town. You know, there was a division there between the applicant and the town board, but I felt that it was my responsibility to advocate for a proposal if I thought it was good for the town. And I remember one in particular, the Hawks, Gary Hawks and his wife, Susan, wanted to build a new house adjacent to their wharf at Cunny's Harbor. And the old house was there. Their father, they had grown up there, Susan had grown up there, and I thought it was important that they have a place to live there right by their business to keep the feel of Cunny's Harbor Village intact, that they shouldn't be forced to build a house off somewhere in the woods simply because the lot there in Cunny's Harbor was tiny. And so they had gotten approval of a new septic system, and they came to the town to build a new house. So I recused myself and sat in the audience and argued for Gary and Susan, and it was enough to change a couple board members' minds, I think, and they approved it. And they built a beautiful little house, and Susan had her business there, and I think that was a success story. When you're on a board like that, you usually either make one friend in a neighborhood full of enemies, or several friends and one or two enemies. So that's usually the outcome, and I tried to avoid that. I thought that shoreline zoning and zoning of some sort was important to protect the environment, to make the town orderly, but keep its character. And I thought that was my responsibility, even individually. Mm-hmm. And
are you involved with the old fuel station and planning for that?
Somewhat. I've been on numerous comprehensive plan committees who wrestled with that issue, and lot sizes. The thinking about that among planning boards and communities has changed radically in the past 50 years, I would say. On the other hand, if you sit back, if you're an advocate for large lot sizes to discourage development and keep the town as it is, stop and look at the reasons why, quote, people from away come here. They come here because there are clusters of villages, the scenery's beautiful, and all of that, and what can you do to preserve that? Sometimes environmental issues are a problem, but people still flock to Cape Cod. Look how close the houses are on Cape Cod and how narrow the streets are, and that's part of the attraction, actually. On the other hand, it runs counter to environmental issues often. So there's kind of a fine line. I think that a town and even a state, let's mention the state and the bicentennial year, have to wrestle with still. Of course, in this plague of biblical proportions, people are escaping to Maine from New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, where COVID-19 is rampant. They come to their summer homes, of course, and they come here and rent a place if they can to escape the virus. And I know that the state and all sorts of health authorities are trying to discourage that because it may actually spread the virus. But these rules that they've set up, such as a 2-week quarantine, are really unenforceable in my view. And if you appeal to people with common sense, I think that they will respond and follow these health rules. And I don't think they're the type of people who, quote, want to open the country back up to business. I understand that young people with families are really hurting, that the financial strain is great, and that many are up against it. But
has the pandemic, the current pandemic, changed your view or given you any thoughts on life? And
yeah, I think this is unprecedented in my lifetime. And it certainly is going to change the world. And your question about how Harpswell has changed, I think it will change at least social interaction considerably. It has already, I believe. Harpswell has become more populated. It's become a place for people, many people retire to because it is nice and basically unspoiled. You can see that coming up the coast. My years on the planning board and Board of Appeals and my little stint as selectman, my one-term stint as selectman, all show that. And other people, in the old days, we had families that came for the summer. As a family, they usually stayed the whole summer. They were well respected and they were part of the community. They volunteered to do things like put on the annual art shows, to put on flower shows, and they had an investment in the community. Nowadays, it's many more people who come for a vacation for only a couple of days, or they are just day trippers or something like that, who don't have the investment that the old-time summer families did. In my growing up years, there were not many transient people who came and went from Harpswell. It was a settled summer colony, and it was settled natives who didn't always agree, but who, I think, for the most part, respected each other. That old one, "Oh, he's from away," annoys me tremendously. It really does. I think it's discriminatory. I think it's stupid, if I can use terms that strong. I think you have to respect each other, you have to get along with each other, and you have to work for each other's benefit. That's the only way that society is going to survive, in my view. Look at the political divide in this country. All elections show that it's almost 50-50. And they can't seem to get anything done. They can't, the need to compromise is understood, but they will not. And I think that's tremendously sad. I think it's a bad thing, both for the country and even locally. I think these demonstrations against public rules are bad, simply bad on the face of it. I understand people's frustrations and the financial strain, but that's not the way to resolve things. I'm on a rant, aren't I? Having said that, I want to say that I said previously, I consider myself the luckiest guy in the state of Maine, to have a great wife, to have a family that's all healthy, to live in this place that I have such a connection to. And I think that although there are drawbacks and social things that have to be solved, and the demise of lots of institutions that I'm fond of, that I have a positive outlook for the future, and that I'm really thankful to have grown up in Harpswell and spent my life here.
Hey ho, roll and go around Cape Horn to San Francisco. Shantyman, sing, boys, pull on the line, and we're back in record time. Now at Bath down in Maine, they built many tall ships. They were paired up and flanked and launched down the slips. The strength of our nation was built on the pine of the mast trees that harnessed the wind. There was schooners and sloops and all kinds of small craft. There were warships with cannon both forward and aft, and the queens of the seas, down easters and clippers, mighty proud men were their skippers.